Namaste and good evening, everyone. Welcome to our continuing series, Evenings with Sraddhalu. Namaste.
Namaste. Happy to be with all of you.
We are happy to continue this evening, the fifth installment of the special theme of how we can carry our current growth of consciousness deliberately in our next life. So, as usually, you may post your question during our conversation in the chat box, or you may send your questions beforehand at our email ID, integralstudies.in@gmail.com. Before starting this subject, we have one question, very controversial, from Trinetra. India is considering to legalize cannabis. What is your opinion and advice on this matter?
In a sense, this is a continuation of the same question along the lines from Spirali about ayahuasca and what we discussed about the dangers of utilization of any of these substances. As long as they're illegal, then there is a pressure on people to at least not use them. Or if they do, then they have to take certain risks. Some may choose, some may not. The moment you legalize, well, it's available to everybody. And it's considered to be normal because something that is legal is considered to be healthy or even normal or acceptable by society. And that may lead, this is a fear, of abuse, excessive use, misuse, or whatever else happens. So before I share my views on this, I'd like to invite Alina to share her experience of circumstances, particularly that she's seen closely in Europe and other places.
So, of course, first, if we need to consider how many poisonous things are legal right now, I mean, or how many poisonous things they are actually infusing into our food, into our soil, into the air, into the water. Yeah, I just feel like, in a way, maybe it's better to give full freedom. But with this, a good education on what's the effect, what it will give to you. So in a way, an integration into the education since early childhood, that should be available. So I just can take a look at one country which is of a high example for us in Europe, which is Holland, which they have legalized cannabis and other drugs since many years ago. And each time I go to this country, you would think, oh, everyone is smoking on the street, but it's the opposite. It's only foreigners who come into that country. They are smoking on the street. And when I was also interacting with the locals, they said, no, for us, we don't need such thing because it's disgusting and they have the refinement of choosing correctly. But the tourists who would come into their country, they will find it interesting, of course. So it's a bit controversial. Also, I think in my country, they're still discussing the same matter if they legalize or not. What I've noticed so far is that a lot of mafia is forming around this drug selling, and this is also very nasty. So somehow I think maybe it's better to expose to the public in a safe way, and very controlled, because even cannabis, perhaps you can have crops of cannabis which carry poison, carry lots of things, and they're selling on the black market, and maybe it's really harmful for the people. In the same way, I'm thinking, for many people who want to soothe their pain, they like to smoke that herb. Why not? They should have access to that instead of getting other drugs which are more harmful than this plant. I think there should be just like a reasonable and a very rational way of how things can be implemented. Of course, we already make great use of CBD. I've tried myself many times, and it's one of my favorite supplements when it comes about sleep or anxiety or depression. So it comes from cannabis, right? But why not to have good quality things and maybe organized under some rules and regulations which will give to the people the knowledge of what it will do for you, how it will affect, how it will impact, And of course, I think everything starts from education. So my point is that if with the education you give all the knowledge to people and information, then maybe they will have the capacity to discern what is, do I want to try? Do I want to use it? Do I want to make use of that? I don't know if this is a good answer.
That's
It's
good.
just one of my opinion.
I think
Already, I
you've
see lots of people drinking on the street, so it's really damaging, and you're feeling sad. So now I'm thinking, if they will also start to smoke cannabis on the street and drink, I'm on the streets in Pondi, walking at night. Now it starts not to be maybe so safe, we would think, right? So it's very difficult to.
so you have raised, actually you brought to four issues even. One is the education of its utility or its dangers, and so right use if there is any. Second is quality control. Once things go into the black market, you may not get sufficiently pure, safe, or otherwise uh, content. It could be also, as we see with certain hard drugs, they're chemically synthesized and sometimes at a very dangerous level of concentration, and people die of drug overdose easily. Third is the control of mafia. The moment you ban something, it's always available at a higher price, and there's a whole industry which is built around bypassing the ban. And the practical result of the bypass is that the worst people with the worst uh, control on finances and misuse of finances will get into society and entrench themselves to push their profit. And then there's a fourth point also, which you have made in passing, which is the medical use and medical relevance. So I want to touch upon all four briefly and connect it to our discussion last time, where I had spoken of say no to drugs. That's it. There is an exception to that. And the exception is for medical use, precisely. And there are two kinds of medical use. One where people have been so hardened that they are in severe depression or whatever the problem is, because of the hardness, where the individuality has been so narrowed and stuck. And you need to practically pry it open. It can be done through therapy, which they may not be willing to do, for which you may not have competent people. It's already the sign of a degenerated society. And in the midst of that, when somebody goes through an extreme condition, certain kinds of drugs which, so to say, thin out the wall of ego, thin the veil, so to say, and open you momentarily to something wider, they are found to be helpful, particularly in post-traumatic stress disorders, where there has been some extreme shock to the whole system, and the whole system has shut down and closed itself, and it loosens up something. So this is one kind of medical use. And the second kind of medical use would be where a person is going through extreme pain, generally as a consequence of cancer or some major injury. And then you use some derivative of plants to control the pain. And sometimes even, as we find, certain extracts, even from the CBD in high concentration, for certain people and certain types of cancer have even been curative, not just pain relieving. Though that is a controversial area, people don't like to face the fact. But we have enough evidence to show that people taking high dose CBD oil, sometimes with THC, were able to reverse cancer, but not all, and not always. So this needs to be studied, certainly, and if there is some utility, one could use it for medical purposes. So having spoken about the medical benefits, which would be the exceptions to the general comment made last time, the mafia involved, which is again a big story, if we can, to some extent, eliminate that by legalization, it's something one could consider. But to me, the most important part would be the education. And I look back at a time, let's say 200 or 300 years ago, when there was no such formal control on the use of cannabis. And even in certain parts of India, it was traditionally used as part of a ritual in certain exceptional situations, or as part of some of the rituals in certain communities, particularly, for example, in the warrior communities in Rajasthan, in the Kshatriyas, they used to take, it's an extract from these plants, which is called bhang. It gives you a certain high. They would take it as part of a religious ceremony, on specific days, specific occasions after consecrating, and then they would drink, get high, get drunk with it, whatever the consequence, through the night. Now, you would ask why. The situation is quite complex. These are warriors, remember. You will never find a Brahmin community, that is, seekers of knowledge, taking any such substances. Absolutely no exception. They will never take. Full stop. Kshatriyas will take. Again, among the Vaishya communities, that is the merchant communities, you don't find that so strong. So it's clear that there was a particular use, and the use is very interesting. When they go to war, there is a peculiar situation where if you get a slight injury, you could bleed to death. And you don't have time to stop to put a band-aid to stop the bleeding. You get an injury early part of the day, and then you're continuing to fight. You could just bleed to death. So one of the benefits of taking that liquid in liquid form, the bhang, it's called bhang. One of the benefits of that is, first, it stops bleeding very quickly. It causes the blood to coagulate rapidly wherever there's a cut. So in the middle of the war, that is critical. And the second, it has the effect of numbing pain and even perhaps enhancing the sense of, or rather numbing the sense of danger. So numbing pain and numbing sense of danger. The benefit of this, of course, in times of war, when you are literally facing your own death, you may not come back alive, or you may come back with a limb dismembered, etc. To be able to face that situation, to be able to survive, return, etc. For all of these, this is useful. You can't then say, hey, now we're going to go to war, let's take the bhang. At that point, you might find yourself destabilized. So within the tradition itself, on specific occasions, which were sacred occasions or some ritual occasions, they would be taking the bhang to acclimatize themselves in the body and to stabilize the sense of the benefits or otherwise, get used to it, so that when the time came when going to war, you could take this again as almost like a ritual preparation for war. So you make your prayers to the deities, ask for the strength, courage, and take your dose of bhang, knowing, of course, the benefits that it would have for the purpose of the war. And so in this way, it is brought into a controlled domain, used with a very targeted objective. And in other spaces, for example, those who are seekers of knowledge, very clearly forbidden. Hey, you're going to lose the clarity of your mind. You want to amplify your intelligence and your access to higher intuitive levels. And this is not going to help you. So you're taught that. And so by formalizing communities, and within communities, the particularly distinct cultures relevant to that communities, relevant to those communities, a very interesting social system was developed, where those who needed it could have it, those who didn't need it or should not be taking it would not have it, and these value systems were different. It is this which the British then perverted by declaring these as castes and social ostracization. It was not so. There were specializations of social values and life. So once you understand this, today when that kind of specialization is not so obvious, we still have a temperament, but it's not so bound within the community structure, at least it's much looser. We can see the place of legalization or non-legalization. Ideally, it would be for those who need it, it's available. For those who need it, those who don't need it, they know clearly the dangers or risks associated and make a choice, even though they know they could go and buy it if they wanted. That would be the benefit of education. And again, I make one more distinction, which is critical here, between cannabis as such versus hard drugs. So this is a point I had briefly discussed with Mark Obern also regarding what he saw as the tearing, the gashes in the subtle body and the exposure to all kinds of influences, including hostile influences that can then hook through these gaps, other than the fact that your own consciousness is, so to say, divided, fragmented, or exposed. He made a clear distinction between the soft drugs and hard drugs. And so cannabis I would put among the soft drugs in this case, but the hard drugs, which would be what are more synthetic drugs, human-made, formulated, the worst of which currently we have a huge crisis across the world is fentanyl, but many other of this kind. And those are the ones which are the most damaging, irrespective. And this is general advice I would give again, repeating broadly what we said last time. Having understood all these, even potential benefits, including medical and otherwise, uh, where you seek a spiritual life, the best thing is to say no, full stop. If at all you've had exposure before in the past, whatever benefits or losses you may have, take it for what it is, move on, but say no from now on. The reason being this: the operation of these things is on the level of the physical biology and through the physical into the vital. So it's of a very low grade of the vital. But because the access is through the physical, it tends to overload the nervous system on a biological level. I've spoken of various things last time already in terms of disadvantages, but I'm pointing out this. Any time in the biology, you overload the nervous system by whatever means, numb it or weaken it for purpose of opening to some experience, which otherwise a strong nervous system would block you from. By artificially weakening it or by pressing upon the body a certain exposure, automatically the body numbs itself to those interventions. In other words, the next time you take, the effect is less, the third time even less, the fourth time even less, but the side effects continue to grow. The benefits drop. This is one critical distinction. This is what leads to addictions eventually. But more than that, you are opening yourself at a level where your biological basis, which was quite strong, now is weakened for the purpose of opening to an experience. And that weakened biology then needs to be repaired if, for the purpose of the spiritual life, you want to hold in your body a tremendous descent of the spiritual power. The intensity of that power needs a strong, healthy nervous system and a strong, healthy body. And you're doing something which is actually weakening that. So again, from the perspective of the integral yoga, if this be the goal, actually to build in yourself a powerful container for the divine action, these are things which are contrary to that direction of development. I've seen people, perhaps I've mentioned it earlier on long ago, I've seen people who had been exposed to even soft drugs. Meeting them, one felt as if there was something inside which was loose. The feeling I'll describe like this: if you took them and shook them, there'll be something rattling inside, like a loose nut, loose screw which had fallen out and somehow was not tightly joined or integrated. In some of the cases, I spoke to them about it and I asked them, I sense this. Do you have such prior history? Some had it casually in teenage, late teenage, etc. Some had longer histories. But inevitably, they agreed that the exposure to that left them with something as if less solid or something missing. In many cases, it was simply subsequent to that, my memory has weakened, or I tend to be in my awareness easily drifting. I'm unable to hold attention clearly, and so on. Now, all of these really represent the power of concentration and the ability to hold focus, which tends to weaken with this exposure. So even if I take the example of Holland, while we see the benefits, and it's very obvious, and those benefits are certainly worthwhile. But the other side, if the children have not been educated and they consider it a recreational pastime because it's legal. So assuming now they're not smoking in the streets, but in their homes. It's a weekend. Well, you have cannabis followed by whatever it is to enhance the experience. The practical result would be, in a very short time, in a few years, the overall power of intellect, power of concentration, power of higher gradations of consciousness, and that access would tend to dilute, dim, reduce, or even be lost. And it takes a long time to rebuild because you have damaged it at the level of the nervous system. If you damage at the level of mind, you can correct it relatively easily because that's fluid substance. You damage it at the biology level, rebuilding takes longer. So again, I'm putting it in the context of a spiritual life where this would matter. For somebody who does not seek a spiritual life and is quite happy with whatever the happy-go-lucky life that comes with it, it may not matter. Nevertheless, there would be consequences of this kind. So I think with this we
Maybe
get a
we should
big
also
picture.
add
Yes,
the effect of like starting these drugs at a very early age versus when you're already formed. But what
very
happens,
good
because
point.
now in school they will start very early, like at the age of 12, 13, 14, they already have this
Yes, very
temptations
good point.
in the school.
Very good point.
That's
The damage done while the body is in formative stage is far greater than after it has formed. I've shared before, perhaps I had seen this in one of the researches, very interesting, that they tested people who were smoking and they distinguished people starting to smoke at various ages. What was seen at the level of the DNA damage caused by smoking, those who started smoking after the age of 21 had little to no damage on the DNA level. Those who had started before 21 had damage on the DNA level, which was visible, measurable for the rest of the life. So I think this is a critical element also to keep in mind.
And if you tell them at school this point, just this point, it's so important that maybe they will really reconsider of waiting and not doing that at a very early
Exactly.
stage of their
Yes.
life.
Or on the other hand, as is the tendency to imitate the elders, they may still get more curious. So a lot depends on the grade of level of consciousness of the collective and the education which we can provide. If we can give them, I'm going to say, something deeper and higher in the educational experience early on, then the warning should be enough. And perhaps through the life, they will never bother with it. But if they have nothing, they are hollow, they're depressed, they are beaten down by the system and all the other associated problems which come with it, then they will tend to crave for anything which might give them hope for some kind of relief from pain. So it's a complex situation, finally boils down to the quality of society itself, and we have to deal with it with that awareness. So I hope I've given an answer, even if it's not a simple answer. Would you legalize? Probably, at least with cannabis, it might become unavoidable because it's already available. On the other hand, if you do not combine it with proper education and the lifting of quality of experience for the children at school level, in grade of consciousness, I mean, if you do not combine with that, then you might even get a situation which is far worse in the long run, even though short term you may feel it's not such a big problem. I think we can go to the next questions.
We have a nice question from Adamantine. The subject is not the same as reincarnation, but subsidiary or complementary, maybe. I have read the mother's words about the possibility and therefore the importance to consciously shape the newborn to be, including down to its physical shape. Could you elaborate on the subject of conscious pregnancy on the path of integral yoga to prepare the ground of the highest possibilities for a new reincarnation? And we also have another related question from Emilian. We have the beautiful conversation of the mother to the woman of Japan about the attitude that women should have with their future child, and also the story of the woman who looked at a beautiful painting every day during her pregnancy, which enabled her to give birth to a beautiful child. Could you also give other advice on how parents to be, both mother and father, how can accompany their unborn child from conception to birth?
Good, both questions are important. In the chat box, there's a question with the previous topic. There are tantrics who are known to use bhang. What is your opinion on that? I think it's useful to, because these are connected with the idea of spirituality. Tantrics are supposed to be practitioners of some spiritual path, isn't it? And they take this. What is interesting is the ones who take this are those who follow typically what is called the left hand path. And you will see they are crude, coarse, ascetic, and very raw, hard in their nature. This is not true of tantrics who follow, for example, Sri Vidya, where purity, cleanliness, and the sense of opening to the Divine Mother is the priority. None of them would take such things, at least traditionally. And now there are also mixtures. There are people who will take alcohol as part of their worship and things like that. But that's more like an aberration. But the idea here, of course, is on the higher portion, at least the idea that you should be immune to any influence. It's more like an excuse. But to the coarser side of the left-hand path, the starting point is you are so coarse. and the path is suitable for those who are very coarse and crude and hardened, that you use the things associated with your coarsened state of consciousness and use them as a lever to turn to the divine. And so it does not apply normally to people in the spiritual life. So I'm putting that as an exception and the scope of the exception. Coming to Adamantine and Emilian's question about the child and a pregnant mother, and of course, including now the parents to be, both mother and father, how do you accompany the unborn child from conception to birth? One would ideally even begin before conception. So in the Indian tradition, we have a lot of stories of a king, for example. It's always associated with a king or a rishi, some exceptional person who desires a child, king, queen. And because they desire a child, they prepare themselves with intense tapasya. Now, the idea is you're actually gathering spiritual energies, building a certain focus of purpose and intention with your aspiration, intensifying it to such a point that now you're ready to receive an exceptional soul as a child. So, first step, your state of consciousness in which you open to the conception of a child is crucial. If you can lift it as high as you can, that would be ideal. One-pointed if possible. There's an example of a Russian, not in the spiritual domain, but he is a Russian person who I think himself was not very good at chess or was reasonably good. And he aspired to have children who would be masters in chess. And it was a one-pointed focus of aspiration. He built himself, prepared himself for that. And he had 5 children, if I remember right, one after the other. All 5 were chess masters and reached some grandmaster level or so. He himself didn't have that capacity. What was it that made it possible? It's not as if just the training did it. If you try to train a child whose soul has come with a different purpose and you try to push the child, he will never excel in something which is not aligned to the soul's purpose. So what happened? Because he had this one-pointed aspiration and was prepared to commit to it, souls which were aligned to that line of experience were attracted to this space. And then he gave them the necessary nourishment, support, training, etc., which allowed them to bloom in the direction they had anyway come to build an experience in. So it gives you first reference that the base you set will allow or attract the kind of consciousness being in a suitable grade of evolution aligned to this. So this would be the first step. Through conception and during the pregnancy again, one would ideally continue to nourish this and build in consciousness the support. It actually goes very far in the Indian tradition. You are even told that the mother who's carrying should not be exposed to any distress, even the slightest emotional distress. Now, it sounds a bit extreme because our view of things is too superficially material. In Mark's book, he narrates this being in the womb, the memory of being in the womb, in the fetus. When his mother underwent certain kinds of emotional distress, the experience was for him literally electric currents and severe pain flooding his body as a fetus from the blood of the mother. And it was so painful he could not stay identified in the fetus and was thrown out in an out-of-body experience, just to rest and recover before reintegrating. So it gives you a glimpse of the experience from the fetus point of view, because it is at a very delicate formative stage. And in that delicate formative stage, the slightest distortion will build or will tend to create extreme distress. And so at that point, no disturbance, no distress of any kind. To the extent they will say, whatever the mother craves, you give. Whatever the mother wants, you pamper. And you make sure the mother is always in a state of constant happiness and joy. Now, the same may not apply as strictly to the father. There is a reason why nature has created mother and the father as in the masculine characteristics and qualities more protective, because he takes the brunt of the pressure of life and insulates the mother who's pregnant from that pressure. And so his role is somewhat different in this case. Nevertheless, if there is a conscious infusion of sense of aspiration, purpose, even substance to the child in formation, even in the fetal stage, you will find it can be of a great help. So obviously from the original conception, there's an idea. That's why the word conception, you conceive, but conceive is starting from an idea itself, all the way down to the biology, and then through the growth, and then through the birth, and so on. So ideally, there would be an entire program all the way through. My mother particularly narrates even at the point of the birth that she was consciously offering the child during childbirth to the mother. So it's possible to take really, really far. Your body is under pain, and yet you are concentrating on that. And so a lot is possible if you dwell on it in this way. Coming to the specific of how you can shape even the form, the physical form of the child, yes, one can. So there are two possibilities. One is you choose to shape for a reason, as the person who was training his children for becoming masters in chess, or you say, whatever the Divine Mother wills, instead of you putting a fixed sense of idea, purpose, direction, you open to her working within you and allow the soul to infuse itself, assuming now, because of your state of receptivity, already a more conscious soul has come who would want to infuse its own sense of purpose. But if you are very clear from the beginning of a certain kind, line, and there's a clear, narrow purpose, then perhaps it wouldn't matter, because the soul that would come would be aligned probably to that purpose. And so you could still actively infuse. So what you would do in this matter, I would suggest, let the mother, and if the father is sensitive also, let the mother feel what the child in the womb wants. And if the soul is conscious and the mother is sufficiently conscious, there will be a very clear sense of communication of what is needed for the child. And then you feel and follow that. That would be the general guideline I would give. And if from that sense of contact, identity, empathic connection, the child will tell you what you need to direct your attention to, or what you need to infuse, and so on. Or you'll feel it as if your child's and yours will be literally joined at that moment. And you will know what to do and how to do it, how much to do also. But this would require already that you become certainly much more conscious in terms of this sensitivity.
May I add something?
Yes, please.
Because I've been studying a lot what happens during this process, and in what I've learned, we call it the project purpose. I mean, the child before 9 months was conceived. During the pregnancy, 9 months, and the first year of life, these are the building blocks, let's say, of his future. And we really emphasize how important it is, the whole environment during those 3 years. And because the child doesn't have yet an individuality on his own, of course, he will just absorb everything like a sponge, whatever happens in its environment. From her mother, the total identification with his mother, it's so deeply. So you feel everything is like your own experience, whatever happens outside, and everything is projected like almost your own experience. And it is really important, to give that beautiful environment where the child can grow beautifully and harmoniously and in a very safe and loving environment. And we should never forget that the psychological conflicts of the family, they will be reflected in the child's behavior, or maybe in a disease which the child will have, congenital diseases. There are so many, and you cannot blame the child, no, but we always can look what was the issue that the family had, what was their traumas or their conflicts or the state in which they were living. It's very important that we should take that full responsibility upon ourselves and really remind that the child is going to reflect the state of the consciousness of whatever issues or traumas or whatever emotional distress was in the family. that will be translated in the kids' behavior or as a disease. Yeah.
Because today it's much more complex on the biology level because of the poisons in our food, in the air. And some of these poisons even pass the natural barrier that nature has created to protect the child, the fetus. And even the blood-brain barrier is now crossed with some of these chemicals, which are even the plastics, microplastics we find inside the human brain, because they cross the blood-brain barrier, they're so small.
Perhaps
So
in the placenta, perhaps
they pass the placenta, and what happens to the child at that point if there is plastic in the brain at that stage? So the situation is far more difficult today. It was so simple 50 years ago, barely. All food was organic. There was no GMO food also. All was organic and non-GMO. Today, getting anything which is non-GMO is so difficult, and of course, getting it organic, even though it's labeled organic, you're never sure because the soil might have been contaminated before, and you might not have added anything after. So it's a very difficult situation right now. Nevertheless, the point is to do the best one can. We can go to the next question.
We have a question from Nikhil. In one of his letters on yoga, Sri Aurobindo says that relationships between one person and another changes in the next incarnation so that the evolution of consciousness can continue. What is the reason that Mark's Soburn relationship with his wife has continued to be the same over several incarnations? And the second question.
I think we'll take this and then come to the next question. Okay. So the idea normally is that in a normal transition from one life to the next, the entire personality of the surface is totally different. And it's the choice of the soul, what it takes on and stages it develops. So a relationship here in this life would not carry over. The only thing that might carry over if there was something deeper at the soul level, or there was a strong karmic compulsion that had been built up, which imprinted itself. Again, it could work out through somebody else, or it could work out through an individual, but it depends. So other than those exceptions, one would always be different. It's very rare to have somebody meeting again and again and with similar roles. So in Mark's case also, it's not in every life. It is, I think if I remember right, he said 4 or 5 across quite a long time though. But in between, there was no contact. So it so happened in this life also, he happened to meet this woman. And his first tendency, as you will read in the book, was to completely ignore her. There was no interest at all. Until something popped up within him that reminded him that this was somebody he had known in the past, and with whom there had been an exceptionally special relationship going back in the incarnation some 300 or 400 years ago in India. That being the point of special connection is why he took interest again, and eventually they got married and so on. So in his consciousness, it was always that particular relationship they had in that life in India, which now was coming back, and as if he was trying to recreate and relive that while she had no interest in it at all. And then you see what happens in the book. It's very interesting. So probably, and he concludes there, initially he thought there was something karmic, and then he concluded it was not karmic at all. And there were other complexities in addition. So the point is, this is rare, but it does happen. When it does happen, well, it happens. And he was clear it will not happen again, at least with her, at least it's done, whatever it was. So it's one of those things where across lives, we do meet people who are familiar. It does not mean we have to replicate the relationship. It does not mean we have to follow whatever comes as memory. Rather, simply renew or build anew whatever is natural to this life for this current personality and its purpose, if there's anything, and often there is nothing. So I had a few examples I may share. It's one of those things which I normally avoid speaking about, but it's perhaps useful to understand in this context. As a student in the ashram school, I had constantly this sense of very high sensitivity because of the contact I had with my teacher. I had constantly this sense of looking for people who were familiar. And it happened through my school years. There were 3 cases where I recognized, this is a known person. One of them was this young girl at that time. She had just joined the school in between. She had not joined from the kindergarten stage. And there was a play going on where she was playing this particular role. And suddenly something clicked, and I said, this is a known person. That's it, nothing else. I had no other interest. Surprisingly, in about 2 years, that girl, you see, in India, there's a tradition of putting a rakhi. That is, you put this little uh, cloth or thread made flower like thing on the wrist. And the idea is a sister puts it on a brother, and the idea is the brother would protect the sister or be there for her in times of need. And so there's a special ceremony. It takes place every year. All the sisters prepare this, put it on their brothers' wrists. Now, this girl had no brothers. And for some reason, out of the blue, I had never spoken with her. For some reason, out of the blue, she picked 3 people in the ashram school on whom she put the rakhi. And I was one of them. I'd never spoken with her. Why would she do that? So obviously, somewhere inside, internally, there was a sense of familiarity, comfort. It came. And she was very young, so there was not the strong formed intelligence to question and doubt or block it. So subsequently, it happened a few years and then it faded out on its own. But I'm just giving this as a very objective example of recognizing something, and that was it, no other contact. So it does not mean just because there's a recognition of some kind that you have to now do something about it. It's there, okay, and known person, no big deal, move on. Unless for in this life, certain things happen. So the best is to let your circumstances of life unfold freely without these considerations, except where there is something that comes. Now, I had this also experience with a couple of people where recognizing the person, oh, it's a known person, there was also the clear perception there's a baggage there. And internally a clear warning, be careful, there's baggage there. Now, it's not something one articulates in thought. It was just sensed, and I said, okay. And one is careful not to allow that baggage to pop up. I don't know what form. I don't even want to pay attention to it. I'm just aware there's something. That's it. Move on. Live your life as if you're free and this is your choice. So every moment is your free choice. Don't be bound by past compulsions. I give another example, which is in such cases where the mother declared that somebody was a known person reincarnated, and there were a few such cases in the ashram. Somebody has reincarnated, and it was so-and-so who's now reincarnated. The family or the people, friends of those were naturally interested and made contact in some cases. The question I asked always was, if the mother had not said this, would you still be as friendly or as interested to make that contact? And in most cases, you will find they would not have recognized. So what is the value of that contact? If you have a recognition, there is a value to the contact that comes from recognition. If you have no recognition, someone says so-and-so X is reincarnated Y. And so you rush because of the idea of it. Does it have value? It's interesting. So I'll share one more example, which I hesitate to say, but maybe it would still be, this would be the appropriate time to share it. So there's a person who was so the mother had made an observation that in my case, that there was a prior incarnation in the ashram space. And there was a person who was son of that man. And there was no particular thing. Like I said, unless there is a deeper connection, what is the point? It so happened that this person then came in touch with me on a closer level because of a certain spiritual interest. And we were together in a certain meditation space on several occasions. He had very deep experiences during that time. Literally, he had experiences of the psychic world that he described to me what he had experienced. So he had that experience. He went back to his room, looking at, as he told me later, he was looking at Sri Aurobindo's photo with tears, and he was in that experience of the psychic worlds. Then he came back. I was still sitting doing my notes. He came and sat next to me. And he just sat there. He couldn't speak. And he just kept saying, weeping, so beautiful, so beautiful, so beautiful. And he had just tears flowing. So I sat there, okay, and I was feeling the glow of his experience, enjoying that. And somewhere inside me, this feeling arose, almost like he's a child. And I was just feeling that. And very strangely, from deep within the heart, from the space which should be really deep, from the origination of the psychic influence, perhaps, it's as if a hand came out, caressed his face, and said, Beta, which in Hindi would be child. It was not me, something else. I said, oh, what's this? I don't think he would have felt it. But this was an interesting example of how, although the soul has kept no major thing on the surface of that personality, still where the link was of a deeper level, and I would say of a soul level of contact, and even if it was brief, momentary, then it can express itself in a passing influence. And that was it. Nothing before, nothing after, of that nature at least. He may have had certain things associated with the idea of that relationship, but that's not important. The actual experience was this. And later, of course, he has passed on now. So I give this as an example. What does it matter what the past relationship is if you cannot recognize its relevance today? And if it is relevant, to the extent it's relevant, it's there. To the extent it's not, you don't need to recreate something. Live your life as you would freely. And that is the better way. And that is a requirement for the soul's free evolution. And so that's part of the Nikhil's question. And we'll now see text of Sri Aurobindo where this will come up. We'll take his next question.
From Ankit. Please, second
Nikhil,
question.
yeah.
Yes. Will my respectful emotion, love to the departed being reach to him or to her in his or her new incarnated being?
So this is largely following what I had already expressed. If there is that connection that you feel, then it has meaning. Otherwise, it's just an idea you have. Oh, so and so, my ex person from this life, now incarnated in some body, I don't know which one, and I want to send her that personality, my feeling, my affection. But this personality which is incarnated, will she get it? Can't say. It depends. Depends if there was that deeper contact, which in most cases was not. I mean, not emotional deeper, but soul deeper contact. If the person is disembodied still, has not incarnated, then perhaps something will reach. Again, depends on their state. If they're reasonably close to the physical world or keep an interest still turned to the physical world, yes, it could reach. If they withdraw at a certain point into a deep state of trance or choose to have withdraw generally from the sense of the physical world, the distance is so great in quality of consciousness that generally nothing much will reach. But there's no harm in sending goodwill and affection. Not out of compulsion, not out of sadness, not out of emotional distress. That does not help, that in fact harms. But if you send something of pure love and affection, it can touch, but it may not. It depends. And you will feel it. Again, I give this example. I mentioned this perhaps. My teacher, MP Pandit's sister, the eldest of the sisters, she had passed on. I don't remember now exactly which year, but it must have been 1983, 84, perhaps. He was at that time out of station. And I had done her last rites. Subsequently, every year on the day in which she left her body, we would remember her. Just as a general remembrance, her photo, which was somewhere, we would place it out, just as a remembrance. A couple of times it happened that we had forgotten. And during the day, the thing popped up in a significant way in a conversation. And then suddenly we said, oh, it's actually her that day. So we would bring that out. So what we did after 1 year of observance of the day of passing, we focused on the birthday. That was the day of renewal of that contact. Then suddenly, one particular year, And I don't know exactly when it was, roughly from memory, I might say 1989 or 90. It was as if there's nothing. Even if you remember, there's nothing. You can't feel anything. Both my mother and I had exactly at the same time the same observation. And we said, perhaps she has taken birth again. That's why we're not feeling that anymore. I don't know. It's subjective, very subjective, except that it was objectivized in two people at the same time, quite independently. So my mother and I both felt the same way. And so I take it that's an indication, perhaps, that she had reincarnated at that point. Then, of course, there's no point in reaching out to that person other than your sentimental idea of, oh, that my grandma, my whatever it is, she's incarnated, she's moved on. You don't even know, would you recognize her if today you met her in this new body? Probably not. So what's the value of that? Except your sentimental value towards your sentimental attachment. That's all there is, which will pass with this life very likely. So it's useful to put in perspective these things. And I think I've also answered the question itself of will it reach, when and when not. So all this is now a useful background for us to go deeper into the question, what happens when you leave the body? Where are you? What determines where, in which world, at what state level you will be? And when you will reincarnate, and what will be that mechanism and timing of that reincarnation? So all this is part of the chapter which we have started studying. We kind of digressed because the theme is so rich and interesting of reincarnation. There were so many questions. So we'll come back to the text now. And there are many more questions people have sent, which we will take up in the coming sessions. But let's continue with the text for a while. So the chapter itself is chapter 22, I believe. I put the link in the description box. Rebirth and other worlds, karma, the soul, and immortality. Our purpose of taking this theme was the last portion, the immortality portion. How can we actually carry over consciousness across lives? But all this is now background to it, which is extremely useful. So, as with every chapter of the Life Divine, Sri Aurobindo has quotations from the Upanishads or the Vedas, which are aligned to the theme of the chapter and even give you in seed form the idea of what the chapter conveys. What is interesting is for this particular chapter, the three quotations from the Taittiriya Upanishad, Brihad Aranyaka Upanishad, and Shvetashvatara Upanishad, in all three, it is the idea that the soul is utterly free. So the translation from the Taittiriya Upanishad text, he writes, he passes in his departure from this world to the physical self. He passes to the self of life. He passes to the self of mind. He passes to the self of knowledge, in this case, Vijnana. He passes to the self of bliss, Ananda. He moves through these worlds at will. Straight away, the suggestion is all the gradations that the soul might pass through according to its stage of evolution, let's say, on departure from the world. And depending on where you live at in your evolutionary gradation would be the primary status of your resting, so to say, in between lives. But again, you're free. He moves through these worlds at will. So he goes to these, but there would be a tendency, because you're in an evolutionary stage where you will want to reincarnate at that grade. So there will be a tendency to be largely settling in that domain. Now, again, this is true at the lower levels of evolution, where you're largely bound in your consciousness. You have not yet recovered the full freedom of yourself. To the extent you've evolved and recovered more and more of your freedom of self, you're not bound. You could go anywhere, although you belong to, so to say, this gradation of, in terms of the evolution that you've put out of your sheaths. And that's all. So this is one. There's another which he discusses. The next one is Brihadaranyaka, about action, the cause of birth, soul's passage to other worlds. All these are covered in a particular quotation. In the Shvetashvatara quotation, he says, doer equipped with qualities, a doer of works and creator of their consequences, he reaps the result of his actions. He's the ruler of the life and he moves in his journey according to his own acts. Again, you see the sense of overall sense of freedom. He has idea and ego and is to be known by the qualities of his intelligence and his quality of self. And a smaller than 100th part of the tip of a hair, the soul of the living being is capable of infinity. So again, this idea of size, scope. Male is he not, nor female, nor neuter, but is joined to whatever body he takes as his own. So you being free, whatever you identify with is what now, so to say, binds or limits you because of the identification. So they're all very interesting, very carefully selected quotations. There's a fourth, which is from the Rig Veda, which, very brief quotation, mortals, they achieved immortality. And it is this to which we will return in our study of this chapter towards the end, where he teaches us how to make the transition across lives consciously, retaining full continuity of awareness so that you don't have to be effectively forgetting and you can continue consciously even where you left off with relevant memories, etc. So that we will keep for later. First, now we will explore the immediate domain of what happens. So he raises three questions. First question he raises, the process of rebirth. Second question, he says, if that process is not quickly successive, birth immediately following death of the body, so that you have an uninterrupted series. If there are intervals, then that raises the question of the principle and process of passages to other worlds. That's the second question he takes. And what happens there before you return to earth life? And then third question he asks, the process of the spiritual evolution itself and the mutation which the soul undergoes in its passage from birth to birth through the stages of its adventure. So very clearly, the journey is an adventure. So these three questions he will then deal with through the rest of the chapter. And as a lawyer, he says, if this is so, it must be so. There's a logical consequence. It would be a very different story if Sri Aurobindo simply says, this is how it is, that's not how it is. You could do that, but then the question of why would be left largely unanswered. Even if you explained it after making a statement, you would largely be binding you to a particularity. And as you notice, and Mark repeats in his book so often, there is so much variation. The universe is built on the principle of freedom. There's so much variation, almost every case is unique. That's how one can see it. And at best, one can make general comments. Again, when questions of this kind are asked of the mother, what when the soul enters the body, in the womb, before fetus, during birth, after birth, and her answer is the same. There are as many cases as there are people. But broadly, generally, one can say like this. So rather than saying generally it's like this, and then you will have these 4 or 5 or 10 or 20 variations, what Sri Aurobindo does is he goes back to first principles. If this we accept, then this is a consequence. If that be the case, this is the consequence. If we accept this and this is the consequence, what are the further options? And if you follow this, if you follow that line, what happens next? And so on. Like a lawyer, he builds from first principles the entire scope of what can happen, where there is freedom, and what are the primary guiding principles. Once you understand this, all variations are available to you, and you understand why and how they could be. That's the beauty of Sri Aurobindo's approach. He doesn't just tell you, oh, this is so. Because in doing so, he would have reduced it to just that particular case or even that generality. And you would not know there are so many other variations of cases possible even. So in the text that follows from there, he says, if the physical universe were the sole manifested world, or if it were a quite separate world, all other worlds are, maybe they exist, but they're far, far away. Like in the Christian conception, heaven is out there, hell is down there. Your world is pretty much isolated and separate. So rebirth as part of the evolutionary process would be confined to constant succession of direct transmigration of one body to another. He's taking this example. If you were stuck in the physical world only and there was no other world, you would have to immediately take birth after one is over. Death would immediately be followed by a new birth without possibility of interval. The passage of the soul would be a spiritual circumstance in the uninterrupted series of a compulsory, mechanical, material procedure. Now, interestingly, among certain Buddhist traditions, let's say, we have to always recognize there are other variations, but among certain, and there are quite a large number of them, where there is no conception of other worlds, there is only this gigantic machinery of karma. They'll actually tell you that you are born immediately after you die. So Mark, in one of the talks, he shared this. He said he spoke to one of these Buddhist teachers, big, well-known name, and asked him what happens after death. The guy said he takes birth immediately. So Mark dismissed him and saying, as somebody who has no idea at all, no experience. He asked him, where do you get this knowledge? Oh, we have read it, so and so told me. No value. So, but still there's a context to it. The moment you limit reality to just the physical world, this would be the consequence. Now, as we will see, Sri Aurobindo going to first principles will show you when such a thing actually happens also or can happen. There's actually a situation within the freedom and the reality of other worlds. There are situations where a person may reincarnate almost immediately. What would be that? And we'll see from the first principles, it'll be obvious. So he's taking trouble to take each of these cases and the logic of these, breaking out of the logic's narrowness and building the fullness, but justifying that narrow viewpoint in its narrow place. But we have found that there is life. There is a life on other planes after death and before the subsequent rebirth. So this was a discussion in a previous chapter where it was logically built. A life consequent on the old and preparatory of the new stage of terrestrial existence. So the consequence of your current life will be this, and it would be preparatory for the next life. Other planes coexist with ours, are part of one complex system, and act constantly upon the physical, which is their own final and lowest term, receive its reactions, admit a secret communication and commerce. So here's one of those very interesting complex sentences. He has put a whole series of significant ideas together in an interdependence of the ideas themselves. So actually the compactness of the fullness of knowledge in a short sentence is extraordinary. So let's decompress it a little bit. Other planes coexist with ours. They're simultaneously present. That coexistence means, in the word coexistence, there's also interdependence implicit. So you have not one, several, let's say, other planes coexist with ours, are part of one complex system. So each of the planes is one part of a system which is complex, but that complex system is one. Now just you take this simple statement, and out of this you will derive a huge, extraordinary complex insight. So let's take, there are several planes beyond the physical. Each is a part of the one complex system. But the one complex system has so many parts, but it is still one. That means naturally there is an interdependence between all of these. And if it is one, then each is influencing all others. If each is influencing all others, in a sense, by the fact of being influencing, they are as if interpenetrating each other. Isn't it? If you're influencing, there's a connection that something of that is here, something of this is there, and they're interpenetrating. A complex system. So even the word is complex, not a complicated. It doesn't say complicated, complex. Complex means there is a rich interdependence everywhere of all parts. So other planes coexist with ours, are part of one complex system. And if it's one complex system, anything happening in one will affect the rest because they're a part of one system. That's the basis of the word system, isn't it? System is when everything is interacting by kind of an interdependence. That's what makes for a system. And act constantly upon the physical. So all those planes act constantly upon the physical. What is their relation with the physical? So he says, which is their own final and lowest term. Now this just blows your mind with the picture it gives you. Each plane, you see in a textbook, you're shown planes in sequence, stacked one above the other, as if one layer after another. So normal idea is to go from the physical through the vital, through the mental, through the higher spiritual gradations. So if you want to go to the mental, you have to pass through the vital, right? Because you pictured it like this in layers. Or you go to the spiritual, you have to pass through the vital, then the mental, and then you'll go to the spiritual. No, but the picture he gives you now is very different. Each acts constantly on the physical, which is their own final and lowest term. So from any plane, if you go down, down, down in gradation, of that plane, there's a point where that plane's gradation touches the physical grade. So in the mental world, you can as if go down in materiality of the mental substance until it approaches something which becomes almost of a physical substance and touches the physical plane. Now look at it the other way. From the physical, therefore, you should be able to climb into the mental, bypassing the vital totally. In principle, at least. Right? Would you have the capacity? That's the question now. Or from the physical through the vital, or from the mental to the vital, even you could be able to, because they're all interdependent complex. But now the focus is on the physical. So from every plane, there's a gradation that comes down, and it's final and the lowest term. So it's the lowest term it can go to, but when it hits the physical, it's the final. Stops, so to say. Of course, within the physical, you may have densities, but they're still physical. It stops there. So each of the plane has this connection, acts constantly on the physical. On the other hand, receive its reactions. Each plane receive the reactions of the physical. So obviously now that there's this connection we have built from top down, something happening here will naturally have an effect there. However small it might be, but there is an effect. So this was a very big question I had in childhood. I asked myself, because we grew up with this background of many worlds and many bodies even. So you tell me that my thoughts are taking place in my mental body, and the physical brain is only the transmitter, the transducer, more accurately, which converts the thought into the biology signals. It's not itself the thinking organ. So my question was, how does the shift of thought in mental body substance affect the biology cells? Because finally it has to go through the cells in the brain and from there send a signal through the nervous system. What substance exists that when it wiggles, so to say, would wiggle the biology substance? Or the other way, when I get a sensation and there's a sensation of touch, of heat or cold, it goes all the way to the brain. From brain, it transfers into my actual perception, which is in the mental body and by the mental sight. What is the mechanism where the biology wiggles and can wiggle substance of the mind body? So there has to be a substance of mental grade which is so dense as to be material, and there has to be substance of the material body which is so fine as to be mental, and the two have to kind of hook into each other to be able to make this link. All of this, it was just logical thinking. But then I said, if we can now recognize this, can I create a circuit, electronic circuit, into which this substance could be infused and become a bridge by which the electronic circuit would be modified by thought, or my thought could pick up through that contact the content of the circuit. And this would be the technology for the future. Very simple, logical consequence. But there's a very interesting factor to take in mind. If this is happening and there is this connection here taking place, where the physical is actually putting out its reactions which are received by the substance of those other planes, then if you removed this substance, this gradation in between, would the two separate? So this is all critical to understanding of how the subtle body separates from the physical, yet not die. Those of you who have listened to Mark Obern's talk, he explains this in minute detail. Like I said, I have read many books on out-of-body experiences, but the explanation that he gives of the mechanism of separation without the break, what retains the link? Of course, we say it's the silver cord which is connecting, but how did that form? Where did that come from? What is its substance? How does, at the time of separation, this You see, one-on-one contact, literally the energy grid on your biology body and energy grid on your subtle body are one-on-one placed upon each other. At the time of separation, it's like glue coming apart. And then all those fine threads of link, they coalesce and join together to become the silver cord. That's how Mark describes it. At least that's how I understood it from his description. So, yeah, that makes sense. So now what's happening here through the silver cord transfers to what is here, but because they're separated, this is in a deep state of deep trance while that is free. When you come back, it again reintegrates, rejoins, and it's as if all those fine fibers rejoin everywhere else and you reconnect and now you're bound. But what is that substance? And here Sri Aurobindo explains how that works. So he says, receives its reactions. So from above, acts constantly upon the physical and receives its reactions from the physical to the higher. Admit a secret communication and commerce. Now again, you dwell on each of these ideas. What is the secret communication? Behind the scenes, without you being aware, there's a communication constantly taking place between these worlds, these gradations. So communication means you're informing things. So physical might inform the subtle, but the subtle is also informing the physical, but at a level which is secret. You are not conscious. So even at a biology level, one can detect. These are very interesting experiments done in the laboratory. If there is an imminent danger, you are on the surface completely unaware of. In the subtle body, the knowledge of which is known is now received in the biology, and your biology body is already bracing for the shock of what is known on that level, which here is now already transferred, but to you secret, to your surface consciousness secret, subliminal to you, but in the biology known already. And your body is bracing for a shock. If not for this, life would not survive. This is what you see as instinct in the animals. For example, before an earthquake, before a tsunami, before various natural disasters, they suddenly move away from that space. They don't know why. They are not conscious, but the secret knowledge is coming up and then pushing them. Recently, in several places on Earth, particularly in the Gulf of Mexico, which has been now renamed Gulf of America by the United States, a certain fish which lives very, very deep in the waters has come up. And it's called a doomsday fish because whenever it comes up, they expect some major calamity, like an earthquake, tsunami, or some such thing, volcano, etc. And apparently in the last 1 month, such fish have come up in several places on Earth. So how did they know something is about to happen? It's the secret communication. But it goes the other way. Communication is always two-way. So things happening in your biology are registered up there, from which there may be responses and all kinds of corrective measures taking place to your sickness of the biology from above, already intervening to bring back harmony and correct it. That's what maintains your body's health, well-being, and overall integrity of the health energy system. Because there is that thing above which holds the, let's say, oneness and the sense of life. It holds the body together. And there's a two-way communication. The body's imbalances go up. From there, the infusion of the corrective influence, which unites, unifies, harmonizes, comes down. If that is damaged by strong trauma, that registers in what comes down as a defect in the harmony, which becomes then physical illness eventually. All this now becomes so obvious. And all I've done is taken the text of Sri Aurobindo and pushed the statement and the word to its logical conclusion. All this knowledge is held in compact form here. Admit a secret communication. This is the reason why at the moment of what we call biological death, the body stops, immediately decomposition begins. Why? Why isn't that happening right now to all of us? Because of this link, which is constantly infusing and holding and organizing the body's health, survival, integrity of energy. You remove that link, the moment that link is separated, straight away the breakdown begins. So there's an extraordinarily complex intelligence which is holding this and holding the body's balance. And if you could tap into that and make your body more and more dependent on that and open to that directly, you would not need external corrective medicines. What makes you dependent on the external medicines is that instead of plugging into that, you turn to this and say, without this, I won't survive. Without this, I won't be cured. And so Sri Aurobindo gives the reason for the modern illnesses twofold. One is this wrong faith, and if I remember right, it's wrong faith, and the other is bad genetics. Genetics is important here also because it provides the basis upon which this action can be more effective and so on. But still, secret communication and the other word, secret commerce. This is a very interesting idea because it's not just communication. Communication is information passed on. Commerce is exchange of goods and substance. Transactions taking place of exchange of substance. And this is a very interesting thing where actually, for example, things of the higher grade of substance are infused into the biology grade, infused in the biology itself and fill the substance of biology. Remember, I said there's this material of the brain in the nervous system, generally speaking, but much more centered in the brain, which being biological becomes of a grade which is almost mental in substance. And from the mental body substance, which is being mental substance, becomes almost of a physical substance grade. And the two meeting there is what forms that link. So there's substance descending from above, infusing below, substance rising from below, and the two are, so to say, in a transaction. In a reality, in practice, the biological process to build this very fine substance is very slow, very long, and always insufficient in quantity. This is the basis for the importance of maintaining celibacy, because by high concentration of the blood, you build the next grade, which concentrated, you build the next grade, and the seminal substance being one of the finest gradations, from which further gradations still develop, which lifts that substance until it becomes brilliance of the power of intelligence within you, because it's the substance that allows full and free transmission from below above and above below of very intense grade, because there's more of this substance. Your intelligence actually goes up. So, but building from below is a very slow process. It takes, I don't know, 30, 40 days, typically, according to Ayurveda, if I remember right. There's another mechanism. That substance is already there in the mental body, so to say, and densifying from there. And from there, when there's a strong descent of spiritual force and substantial quality of spiritual substance, as when you have a strong descent of the peace, you actually feel the substance infused into your biology, into your nervous system, into your tissue, and it does its thing. So what normally from below up would be rebuilt in a very long process, from above can be refilled in a very rapid process. But if you have not built the gradations below, which that may not be able to densify all the way to the most material, if you have not built that gradation, then there's a gap somewhere. And so what comes from above does not have the container to be able to hold it and can leak out easily. But if you've built a little from below and the larger part filling from above, one can still hold and build a container and thus intensify the whole tapas, the full focus of concentrated energy in the sadhana. Commerce, the word tells you about this exchange of substance. So I'm going to reread this sentence. Other planes coexist with ours, are part of one complex system, and act constantly upon the physical, which is their own final and lowest term. Final and lowest. Think about the meaning. Receive its reactions, admit a secret communication, and commerce. So in a way, 7 major ideas. And just that in a simple sentence, if you just read superficially, say, yes, he's talking about some kind of continuity. No, but he's used very specific words. You have to pause, think, and go deep. And then you find he's actually revealing all this knowledge. So I remember when I first read The Life Divine, it must be age 20, 21, something. And I read this chapter. I said, yeah, I understand what he's saying. And I understood superficially like this. I said, why isn't it telling more? What is this complex system? How does it act? Why? What is this lower term? What is this reaction? What is communication? Give me examples. Well, he could have. Then the life divine would become like 100 times big, fatter. You wouldn't have time to even read everything. People complain even with this, it's too much. But by compacting it to this level, he requires us to then pause and think. And it's obvious because of the way he has structured, it's obvious pretty much everything he's saying. But with it, you have built from first principles the whole knowledge. If he had given you 10 examples, you would have stopped to the 10 examples and said, this is all, because he didn't mention an 11th, there is no 11th. But when you're going from first principles, from here you can bring out 20, 30, 40 variations, examples. Or someone brings you a new story, you still understand it within the framework, which is comprehensive and, well, universal. So that was one sentence. Now, the most important part, what's the use of all this happening? Man can become conscious of these planes, can even in certain states project his conscious being into them. That's the outer body travel he's talking about. But it's not entirely out of body. It's also taking into account all other variations. So you project your being into them, and the word project suggests the outer body experience. But there are also variants to this where you project a part of your consciousness without leaving the body, in the subtle body. So this could happen in states of meditation, for example, in states of deep concentration, even in states of daydreaming. Sometimes it could happen if the concentration is strong enough. So can even in certain states project his conscious being into them, partly in life, presumably therefore with a full completeness after the dissolution of the body. So very logically he's going. So while you're in life, you can do this projection partly. So consequently, you knock out the physical body, well, that's what you would be doing, but completely. Such a possibility of projection into other worlds or planes of being becomes then sufficiently actual to necessitate practically its own realization. Immediately and perhaps invariably, following on human earth life, if man is from the beginning endowed with such a power of transference, eventual, if he only arrives at it by gradual progression. So again, a complex sentence, but now he's telling you all the case situations of how this might function, to what degree of your capacity. So such a possibility of projection into other worlds or planes of being becomes then sufficiently actual to necessitate practically its own realization. So if this is possible, then eventually it will start happening. If it's strong enough, then it will inevitably happen. So it would happen immediately if it happens strongly enough, or perhaps invariably following on human earth life. So you may happen in the middle of circumstances with this compulsion, or anyway, when your biology quits, it happens. If man is from the beginning endowed with such a power of self-transference, you have developed this capacity, you could do it immediately, you could do it obviously immediately on shedding of the biology. But eventually, you would arrive it by a gradual process. So a little bit now here, level, then another level, then another level, then another level. Gradually, over time, you would build the capacity. For it is possible that at the beginning, he would not be sufficiently developed to carry on his life or his mind into larger life worlds or mind worlds, and would be compelled to accept an immediate transmigration from one earthly body to another as his only present possibility of persistence. So here's the full picture of what happens. Assuming the soul is not sufficiently developed in its evolutionary state, poise, unable to enter the larger ranges of life world or mind world. You're only in the narrower ranges, just thrown out of the physical body. You're in the immediate passage. Being in that passage, and you are unable to stay there long enough, you would be compelled to take birth very quickly again. Remember, we are speaking of this part, which is the evolving portion of the soul's projected consciousness. The soul could entirely withdraw, abandoning that, then it can do what it wants. But if it is staying here, at the moment, oh, I'm out of my body, I'm still me, this person who's not very organized, not very evolved, quite dull in his consciousness, unable even to enter the higher parts of vital or higher parts of the freer parts of the mental consciousness, being bound in this. And I'm in this kind of a limbo, dark passage. I say, oh, what's happening? Let me just reincarnate. Because that's all I can do. So what he shows is actually there is a period of very early insufficiently evolved consciousness where actually there might be almost immediate birth in some earthly body. Now, this would be the case often with certain types of animals, especially the less evolved animals. So the organized, let's say, focal point of consciousness would immediately slip back and rejoin with something, maybe another body which is already alive or taking on new birth. Many, because it's not just sufficiently individualized, many variations are possible. But as you grow, as you become conscious, as you develop this power of self-transference to move across gradations, and then especially when you're sufficiently developed to carry into the larger life worlds or mind worlds, then you would come into your own as a being into those worlds. Now we could assume that a large part of humanity can actually go reasonably close to these worlds or enter the larger life worlds and something of the mind worlds, perhaps. Let's assume that. And then you will see typically what you experience in the near-death experiences or out-of-body states and so on. But if somebody were not so developed, you see how you would stay relatively low, but then also find yourself compelled. The necessity for an interregnum between birth and a passage to other worlds arises from a double cause. Now, why is it even necessary to have this? Why in the larger scheme of things? We have seen logically it makes sense this will happen. But do you need it? Why not just take birth? Or not? So there are two reasons. There is an attraction of the other planes for the mental and vital being in man's composite nature due to their affinity with these levels. And second, there is a utility or even the need of an interval for assimilation of the completed life experience. A working out of what has to be discarded, a preparation for the new embodiment and the new terrestrial experience. So before we continue with the text, you look at these two things. And here we will find already our perspective becomes so clear. Man's nature is composite, meaning we're composed of many gradations of substance. We have already looked at. But broadly, we say mental, vital, physical. But it's not even that. There's much more complex layers of the vital, layers of the mental, layers of the mental, vital, vital, mental, vital, physical, mental, physical, physical, vital, physical, mental, physico, vital, mental, anything, everything. Every blend and mix is simultaneously present. The difference is some are more organized, some are less organized. Some are individualized, some are just a blurred, blank patch of consciousness. So a person's evolution can practically be measured in terms of how much of these gradations is individualized and to what extent those individualizations are integrated. It can be almost like a mathematical measure to some extent, you could say. Mark recalls, it was in the talk which he gave here, people asked questions about his incarnation, prior incarnation on another planet in a different civilization. And he says there the evolution, sense of evolution was very different from the way we think of it here. The way you measured a person's degree of spiritual development was in their ability to act through their consciousness on the circumstances. In other words, if you can apply your consciousness upon those circumstances, that was the measure of your development of that grade or that capacity or that level, etc., and how much. Mother makes a similar observation in the of the supramental world. She says that even though everybody in that world would be of the supramental gradation, there'll be a difference between them in terms of their maturity and evolution. And the difference will be seen in terms of their ability to exercise the power of consciousness organized in them, individualized in them, the ability to exercise and actualize those powers. That would make for the more mature or less mature. The children would be those who, although being in that grade of consciousness, are unable to exercise its potential. The adults would be those who can exercise much more completely with mastery, with precision, with greatness, grandeur, width, size, depth, scope, etc. Very similar to, on a very superficial material level, we would say, measuring our power of thought, measuring our power of expression, measuring our power of organized emotion and expression of those emotions. These are often very superficial references of evolution, but they are too superficial, precisely because the surface expressive power can be deceptively undeveloped compared to the internal unexpressed richness that the person might have, because we're still at a level where the integrations are not strong enough. Once the integrations are strong enough, then we can measure in terms of expression. So the first part he's saying is we are a composite nature. Each part, each grade, each substance, each tendency, each quality of consciousness in this composite nature has a natural affinity to one of those planes or those gradations corresponding to it. Now, if you are a composite of several gradations, then automatically each of these gradations is drawn to those planes. Now, it's very important. I'm going into detail because here you will get the clue to understand where you go, which plane you go to. So let's say now the biology is knocked out. You're in a battlefield, missile fell, body got knocked out. You're not even aware. There's a bam, momentarily a shock, and then you're there in your subtle body. Gross body is blown out. Now, freed of the gross body, all the gradations of consciousness which correspond to every level is naturally tending towards its corresponding world, or in natural affinity, like a magnetic pull, a resonance which draws you. Now think of it this way. If you're being drawn in, let's say, 10 gradations, which gradation would be the most powerful? In a sense, all gradations are being pulled. But what's the composite pull of these, the combination of these? That's the grade overall that you would be tending to naturally, effortlessly drift into in grade of worlds. You would still consciously be able to shift, because you can shift yourself in, I'm thinking, I'm shifting to emotional identification. I'm shifting through various gradations by choice. And in a similar way, you could tune which of these you are aligned to in that state at that moment, which is one of the reasons why in the most religious traditions, they will say the state in which you quit the body is extremely important. That will often determine your future life or the domain, that worlds that you will go to. Because that being activated intensely, well, that's what you will be pulled to. If at that moment you're intensely activated with passion, desire, anger, hatred, well, you go straight to the hellish regions corresponding to those vibrations. That's strongest in you at that moment. You see the logic of it. And all this is explained actually in the way he words this, except you have to sit down, think, and elaborate the consequence of what he has said. So I'm going to read this whole thing. There is an attraction of the other planes for the mental and vital being in man's composite nature due to their affinity with these levels. So broadly, vital and mental, these are the two parts. Your biology primarily being knocked out, these are the gradations. But the vital itself is of many gradations, mental also many gradations, and they're blending. So first is this. Affinity, there's an attraction. So the attraction is what pulls you. And you would tend to feel rested comfortable in that grade. And there is a utility or even need of an interval. So what happens during that interval? Two things. Assimilation of completed life experience, a working out of what has to be discarded, and the third, a preparation for the new embodiment and the new terrestrial experience. So first part is the assimilation. So straight away we are seeing here, in the aftermath, after leaving the biology, the soul will go through these three stages. First part is you've just finished all this rich experience, you have an assimilative period. All this I've been through, wow, and I go through. It's like you've come back from a holiday and you're sitting down and chatting with family or friends and saying, oh, that was so wonderful, this was so nice, I was so moved in this. And you kind of ruminate over everything as if wanting to soak it in, integrate it, so that you won't lose what was received there. From the soul's consciousness perspective, a similar process, but equivalent to its grade of consciousness. Assimilation of the completed life experience. Second part is working out of what has to be discarded. So I've taken in all this. This is worth keeping. All that was good. It was useful. The essential lesson learned. Now the substance of it, the details of it, I choose to discard. Keep what is relevant. And so there's a kind of a consolidation and integration of the most important things, but with discarding. And then with that now turns the whole thing to, all right, so for the next experience, this was my need, this was the direction. Now I begin to shape from all this absorbed rich content with the past many rich contents, all integrated. Now I turn to shape what would be relevant for the next experience. In those of you who have read the book, Mark's new book, he speaks of his future life in China as a scientist, as an intellectual. Personality very different from his current one. So it's almost as if in this life he has huge vitality and the warrior mindset, literally. And that one is more like a scientist mindset, not such a strong vitality, somewhat thinner, taller. And you can feel the consciousness quality. It's not the biology. It's more about the consciousness quality for which the vehicle is so aligned. In order to do this, much of this strong vital will have to be taken back, put to rest. In that life, when a crisis happens, some of this will come forward, but through the vehicle of that incarnated personality. So modified by it. But otherwise, largely put to rest or withdrawn, partially integrated into the new to the extent relevant. But things not put in this life, which are resting behind, which have been prepared for in other lives, now they would be brought forward, elements of this life pulled back. Those things, yes, 5 or 6 lives ago, this was done, that is now useful here, and you bring it forward, and so on. So there will be this whole rearranging and shaping, preparation for the new embodiment and the new terrestrial experience. Sri Aurobindo never wastes words. He's wise, he's saying new embodiment and new terrestrial experience. What's the difference? Embodiment is the taking on of the body, fusing, joining for the purpose of incarnating. Second is the experience itself you will have in and through that body. And these are two different kinds of preparation that the soul has to make for. So you get a clue here. Again, you could dwell on each of these and logically, drawing upon the previous observations, see the consequences of what this would be like. But I will leave it to you as an exercise. But think about it. They're two different things. But this need of a period of assimilation and this attraction of other worlds for kindred parts, the corresponding parts in us, of our being, may become effective only when the mental and vital individuality has been sufficiently developed in the half-animal physical man. Until then, they might not exist or might not be active. The life experiences would be too simple and elementary to need assimilation, and the natural being too crude to be capable of a complex assimilative process. The higher parts would not be sufficiently developed to lift themselves to higher planes of existence. I've read it quickly, but you can see if we follow and pause on each of the phrases, there's so much he has put here. But in summary form, and I don't like summaries because we're losing so much. What he says is this need for assimilation and this attraction to other worlds which takes place will be effective only when this individuality of the vital and the mental are sufficiently developed. In otherwise, what we are, half animal, physical man. So if you go back to a certain grade of human evolution where the larger part of humanity was half animal, physical man, there would not be much of this. There would be brief sojourns, brief touches, and the person would tend to incarnate, as would happen with many animal species. And second factor he gives, the life experience would be too simple and elementary to need assimilation, and the natural being too crude to be capable of complex assimilative process. So again, we're looking at stages of evolution and what happens with those stages. So when life experience is too simple, I took birth, I ate, satisfied my instinctive desires, I died. Okay, what's new? I did that 100 times already. Then what? Compare the life of a dog or a wolf in forest versus the same dog or wolf with a human being in a complex mental environment. How radically different it is. They may still be very gentle, kind, loving dogs or wolves in the forest. Here also they would be the same. In their grade of consciousness, they're pretty much same. But in terms of exposure of life experience, whoa, how much more complex. So I've seen, for example, closely with some of the dogs that I have had a contact with. So having met the dog, built up a certain rapport, I go away. And then there is a phone call, on a video call, I appear. The dog looks at this image, hears the voice, but cannot feel, cannot smell. He's confused, royally confused. He turns away. Initially, there's a shock, there's a reaction. Are you fooling me? What is this? It's not real. Because unless I smelled, it's not real. But what is this? Then, after a while, it adapts to recognizing, yes, it's actually real because the fellow is responding to me and I'm responding to my actions. And then it tries to look behind the mobile phone. Is he hiding behind? He can't find him. Again, he's confused. Eventually, though, they have outgrown that confusion and can now actually relate, even as if communicate. There's one dog particularly, I remember, I had given him a particular toy. It was a rope with knots, and he would play with it. It had my touch, I suppose. Every time that I would call on the video call, he would hear my voice, come there, first check, see the face, then go back, wander the house, find that toy, bring it in front, and play with it by spinning it round and round just in front of the camera. That was his way of saying, I'm acknowledging you and I recognize. So here's a complex mental gradation of experience being enforced upon the dog. For this, the period of assimilation might be more complex and longer, as an example. And the same would apply to the human being. If you look at some of the periods of what we would call Middle Ages, it's very different in Europe and India and other parts of the world. But let's say phases where there was largely, in Europe at least, a suppression of knowledge, suppression of emotions, by very strong, almost suffocating church influence of fear, guilt, etc., imposed on the people, domination, literally enslavement of large parts of Europe. You would go through that life, maybe have a little bit of some pulls, pushes of emotions come back, not much potential for knowledge. Now, the same space you incarnate today, and there's a huge, rich potential just opened up because of modern technology and experiences which it makes possible. And you can still be in your own little village and literally through the internet open out to something very rich and complex. And with the 3D goggles and the sensory experiences which are now on the edge of utility, common utility, you will literally find yourself transported to any place with any kind of material sensory experience. The richness of such a life would require naturally more time and need for assimilation. So the simple and if life is too simple and elementary, it would not need much assimilation. And then if your substance of natural being is too crude to be capable of complex assimilative process, then also. So you see, the biological evolution is critical here as much as the psychological evolution. If the biology is too crude, even with some complex psychological evolution, the ability to integrate would be reduced. And the higher parts would not be sufficiently developed to lift themselves to higher planes of existence. Now, here comes the most important statement, and we're going to pause with this for today. What makes you capable of going into higher worlds? Whether you go out of the body consciously or you are out of the body by compulsion of biology being knocked out. You will still find yourself perhaps in some of the lower worlds of the vital or the lower ranges of mind awareness. What would make you capable of shifting deliberately to wander in the higher worlds? If you have not developed the higher parts sufficiently to be able to lift, to be able to build familiarity, to be able to lift, then that access would be difficult, would be occasional by chance or by grace or by help of some other beings or from the grace working from above, which would infuse into you and lift you or open the way for you to be able to rise momentarily, and then you would still find yourself unable to stay and tend to fall back. As you experience during meditative states, when momentarily you're lifted into a higher exalted state, you can't stay and then you fall back to rest in your normal, familiar, lower, gross, crude, dark, dull state of consciousness. Because that's your normal, that's your familiarity. You can only rest in it. Exactly same thing happens there. So you see a correspondence from the life experience evolution and what happens afterwards, free of the biology in the planes of consciousness. And there's an exact correspondence there. The higher parts would not be sufficiently developed to lift themselves to higher planes of existence. So you have a familiarity, yes, but I'm not developed enough to pull myself into that. So this is a capacity one would develop here, now, in life. And this would be carried into the afterlife stage. And you, for example, when you're upset, when you're disturbed, consciously quiet the disturbance and shift yourself into a poise which is more calm, equal, or higher in grade of consciousness. If you can do that here, then you will do that there in the subtle world. If you cannot do that here and find yourself bound in that vital drama, that's where you'll find yourself bound out of the physical body. So when he continues, we will take a look at this next time. But here already quite a bit of what have come up as questions, you will find answered from this background. Somebody has just gone, is in a particular domain. Will your call, will your feeling, will your projected affection reach them? So it depends on many things. The substance and the continuity of substance, their interest, their turn towards you or not, or they may choose to withdraw, completely turn away. So even if potentially your substance could reach, they may feel something, I feel good, but not recognizing where it comes from. Or they may feel the touch of it and say, it's so and so, and literally reach out and exchange some flow of consciousness momentarily and then move on. All is possible. Or they may find themselves trapped, and the fact that you pray and send peace and goodwill helps them to free from the knot and open to the higher world, reminds them that there is a higher world, awakes in them that higher part which was otherwise not strong enough to lift. But by the prayer and environment you create, they feel themselves pulled or pushed and drawn into the higher realm and free from the lower. All these are possible. And now with the background of the overall principles and mechanics of how this happens, you will understand why we have those so-called rituals after death to help people go across, or the state of prayerfulness and peace and joy or prayer of love, etc., can be of help or may not be needed even in certain cases. All cases now you can actually understand based on these first principles. So that's the kind of insight, and there's much more to follow, which we will look at next time, where you see the kind of insights Sri Aurobindo gives you from going to first principles. That's why this text is so valuable. 100 years from now, even after you have had experiences of going out of the body and experiencing some of these things, when you read the text, you'll find it useful because you will understand why and how this can happen. Isn't it? That's the value of this kind of very condensed, concentrated explanation at first principles. So quite a few comments and questions. Okay, interesting. So Purna Kalvi says, my friend Revati Shankaran has been training parents for years in conscious conception. Her YouTube channel is Little Gems Revati Shankaran. See if that helps you. Why not? Maya says, a good example is Richard Williams, who was in deep poverty and aspired to have precisely two girls who would grow up to be the best tennis players in the world, Serena and Venus Williams. Like another good example, you can see how that works. So Tutun asks, does the sadhana of an individual help his departed parents? Now, with all that we have discussed, the answer should be obvious. It can help to the extent that there is still a link that remains. After a point when they've moved on or they have reincarnated, it may not make a difference. But during the time when they are away, but still linked to you by some substance of empathy or emotion, before that part is shed or withdrawn fully, you may still find that this can help. They have, of course, the freedom. They may stay in those words for a long time and still be linked to you by interest, by choosing to be linked to you by interest. In such a case, they may participate in your sadhana, even draw nourishment from you, if they so choose. But it doesn't mean it is absolutely necessary, nor does it mean it will happen. It all depends on their interest or their choice. So you see, again, the relationship you have, not superficially, but at a deeper level, will determine many of these. How and when it will happen, you have now the template, the overall universal framework in which to understand and appreciate. So the answer would be yes. Depending on circumstances, it could help or not. So Madhuri's question, can our ancestors guide us on the spiritual path? I saw me walking with a light body and a grandmother who gave fruit and was walking with her. Once I saw all my ancestors sitting in line with me, washing their legs. So it does not mean, just because you saw them, that they're still in those worlds. Many of them could have reincarnated. Being in those worlds, again, the sense of family has very little relevance. You're not bound by the same family ties, which are largely emotional, vital, physical. They don't have much value once you cross that threshold. There it would be deeper things, which would be your sense of family. So very likely these dreams are symbolic in what Madhuri has just described. And as symbolic dreams, they could have a value. And because you value the sense of ancestors, that would appear as symbolism. If you did not value that too much, the same thing, the same experience might come with a different symbolism. But it's possible that just your grandmother, if she had just passed on in a short period, let's say for a few weeks or months or even a few years occasionally, there might be brief contacts. It could be relevant. But after a while, if she has reincarnated, it doesn't matter. So Revati is asking about relationships with souls while on earth. Mark talks about his family on a different plane in between births. What is this family? So precisely this, that we have much deeper affinities, which comes from the soul affinity, which could sometimes span across lives and which might be with beings who don't incarnate at all. And so the sense of those relationships is much more deep, much more long-lasting and meaningful because they survive lives. Occasionally, such things may happen also in incarnations. So it's to these that his references seems to be, at least. So V-Truth is asking, in places where our vital and mental are so weak, unwilling, and even opposed to the divine, how should one face it and bring about a change, addictive habits, dopamine highs, etc.? Um, Simple answer here, based again on the background we have set. Where you tend to be close to the divine, unwilling or opposed, being out of the body in those gradations, again, you would experience similar tendencies much more powerfully, though. And so that's why it's always worth it doing it in the body. But being in those states, you will have to face it eventually. And just as while in the body you learn to master your anger, in those states you will learn to master your state and then be able to shift or awaken in that state a deeper memory from the soul that comes, fills and lifts and transmutes or dissolves that knot. Or a help from above. If a part of you prays and asks for help, a light may descend from above, fill and dissolve your knot and help you. All things are possible. Everything that happens here would be possible there, but much more intensely amplified, sometimes more rapidly. But the sense of time being also different. If you're stuck in a dark place, you could be as if stuck in what feels to you like centuries. And unfortunately, that's the reality. Everything is amplified, even the sense of time. So I think we will few more questions, which I'll skip now, to come to the key point, which from what we have read and which is of relevance for us. Everything would depend from an evolutionary point of view on whether we have taken the trouble to develop our higher parts and whether we have learned to master our lower parts and put in relation to the higher parts, bring an overall shift of direction and sense of purpose. And this, in a sense, is what we seek to do in any kind of self-culturing, and particularly in any kind of accelerated evolution that we call yoga. So eventually, what happens in those worlds and in the passage after death would correspond to what you have worked upon here. Of course, it's not limited to that, because you might have done things in prior lives which are available to you in that state, which are not fully available to you now, including sometimes very rich and deep, complex knowledge. So you remember the mother narrating how one of the disciples, Frenchman, whom Sri Aurobindo named Pavitra, Philippe Barbier Saint-Hilaire, his French name. So when he left his body, the mother described how part by part, literally he took parts of himself and transferred them into her and fused them into her. She said this specific technique, knowledge, skill that he had was not developed in this life. It was from a prior incarnation where, as a Buddhist, probably he had developed many of these capacities. And so in this life, he had a very strong pull to the Buddhism first before he came to Sri Aurobindo. But the capacity was there inherent in that deeper layer of him and blocked out on the surface parts, not there in the surface personality. But when the time came to leave the body and he had already half exited, all this was available. And so he could do things which he would not have been otherwise been able to do. So it's to say that it's not so simple that just what you are living in this life. There is much more that you might not be right now living, but which is available to you. And to top it all, above all this, is the constant potential help from above of the divine consciousness, of the divine light, and even higher beings and the divine mother herself. Flowing, filling, molding, shaping, drawing you up. What you cannot do on your own, she can freely do. Which means even if you hold a basic remembrance and an aspiration and opening to her, all the rest she can do. And this is true not only while incarnated, it is even more amplified when disincarnated. So if now you can build this remembrance in a small part of you, and from that small part of familiarity and an opening and a self-giving, this, if you can build sufficiently, will become for you the focal point for the whole of this life's journey while in the body, and also post-life journey when outside the body and potentially into the next incarnation, if this is sufficiently built, organized, and integrated with the soul's aspiration. So of all things, if you had to do something, this would be one thing that you could prioritize over everything else, isn't it? Think about it. And let's hold this as an aspiration for us to practice daily, however briefly, but as intensely as we can, even if for a short time.